I always thought family was supposed to have your back, until I realized sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who take the most. What happens when loyalty, trust, and generosity are met with lies and manipulation? This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the only way to reclaim your life is to play the game on your own terms. Growing up, my brother and I had the same opportunities. We went to the same schools, had the same parents pushing us, and the same resources available. The difference was that I worked my tail off to get scholarships, study hard, and build a career that gave me stability and freedom. My brother, on the other hand, was more about quick fixes and easy routes. When I finally settled into a good job, I had this dream of traveling the world. I wanted to see places beyond my small town, taste food I'd never heard of, and just live. But just when I was starting to save and plan, my parents came to me with a request for help. They weren't in a great place financially, and being the responsible son, I felt it was my duty to step in. I figured my dreams could wait a little while. At that time, I didn't realize how this just once act of kindness would turn into a pattern that would completely reshape my life. Helping my parents the first time didn't feel like a big sacrifice. I told myself, they raised me, they supported me, so of course I'll support them now. I paid off a couple of bills for them, covered some home repairs, and even helped with medical expenses. My travel fund took a hit, but I thought I'd make it back quickly. Then my brother came around. He had a way of making his struggles sound urgent. Car trouble that was the end of the world, a rent payment that slipped his mind, or his wife needing money for unexpected emergencies. Each time, I told myself it was temporary. I was the one in the family who could afford to step in, so why not? But soon, it wasn't just emergencies. My brother and his wife started treating me like their personal safety net. Concert tickets, a vacation they wanted to go on, even new furniture. They'd find some way to phrase it like it was help. And every time, I'd pull out my wallet, convincing myself that being generous was what family was all about. What I didn't realize then was that I was slowly becoming less of a brother and more of a bank. One year, it was my parents struggling with their mortgage. I stepped in, told myself it was temporary, and reassured them it wasn't a big deal. Another year, my brother lost his job for the third time, and I ended up covering his rent for months. Then his wife wanted to start a small business selling handmade decorations. She pitched it like it was their chance to get back on their feet. I loaned them the money, only to watch it collapse in less than half a year with no word of repayment. And it didn't stop there. Concert tickets, vacations they couldn't afford but really needed for their mental health, new furniture, even upgrades to their car. They always managed to frame it as if it was an emergency or an investment in the family's future. At first, I believed them. Later, I just kept quiet, too tired to argue. Meanwhile, I kept working. I climbed the ladder of my company, got promotions, and was in a financial position that most people my age would envy. But none of it ever seemed to belong to me. My savings account was more like a revolving door, money flowing in and then rushing right back out to cover someone else's life. Friends would ask, "Hey, didn't you always say you wanted to see Europe? Or go backpacking through Asia? Why haven't you done it yet?" I laugh it off, make a joke about being too busy, or say I was still planning. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had traded my dreams for everyone else's convenience. Still, I held on to this belief. They'll appreciate me. One day, my family will realize the sacrifices I've made for them, and they'll respect me for it. But as I would later find out, that couldn't have been further from reality. The turning point came on a day that was supposed to be routine. I had arranged to stop by my parents' house after work to drop off some papers and a check for another unexpected expense. Normally, I'd text ahead, but that day, I finished earlier than expected and figured I'd surprise them. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed my brother's car parked outside. I didn't think much of it. He was always around, and half the time I suspected he lived off my parents just as much as he did off me. I walked in quietly, not wanting to startle anyone. That's when I heard voices coming from the kitchen. My brother, his wife, and my parents were sitting together, laughing. At first, I smiled, until I heard what they were laughing about. My brother's wife said, "Honestly, he's such a sucker. Every time you tell him something, he pulls out his checkbook like he's our personal ATM. My brother chimed in, "Yeah, he actually thinks he's the responsible one." He's just too stupid to realize he's funding our lives while he wastes his best years. And then, the part that cut deepest, my mother's voice. Well, as long as he keeps believing it's his duty, why stop him? He doesn't need all that money anyway. Better it helps family than him wasting it on silly trips. I froze in the hallway. My heart dropped like a stone. These weren't strangers mocking me. These were the very people I had sacrificed for, the ones I thought I was protecting, laughing at me like I was some pathetic joke. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like hours. My face burned, my chest ached, and for the first time in my life, I felt something break inside me. I quietly stepped back, left the house without them noticing, and sat in my car, staring at the steering wheel. My hands were shaking. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was just hollow. That was the moment I realized everything I believed about my family's gratitude was a lie. Driving home that night felt like I was moving through a fog. The streets looked the same, the city lights were the same, but I wasn't the same person anymore. I replayed their words over and over in my head until they felt tattooed into my skull. Such a sucker. Our personal ATM. Better he wastes his life for us. I couldn't wrap my head around it. These are the people I had defended when friends told me I was giving too much. The people I had put before myself time and time again. The family I believed loved me, or at least respected me. Instead, I was just the punchline to their inside jokes. When I got home, I sat in the dark for hours. No TV, no music, nothing. Just silence and the ugly echo of their laughter. Anger started to creep in, slow and heavy, but it was tangled with sadness and disbelief. A part of me wanted to storm back into that kitchen, slam my fist on the table, and scream at them for their betrayal. But another part of me knew that if I did that, they'd just spin it back on me. They'd guilt-trip me, twist my emotions, and somehow convince me it was all a misunderstanding. And the worst part? A small, broken part of me almost wanted to believe that excuse, because believing the truth hurt too much. That night, though, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't confront them right away. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me wounded. Instead, I'd pretend nothing had changed. I'd smile, I'd help, I'd play the role they expected. But behind a mask, I'd be watching, waiting, planning. Because if they saw me as nothing more than their fool, then they had no idea who they were really dealing with. The next time I saw my family, it was almost surreal. My parents had invited me over for Sunday dinner, something we did pretty regularly. Normally, I looked forward to it, but this time I felt like I was stepping into a theater about to play a role I no longer believed in. When I walked in, they greeted me the same way as always. Smiles, hugs, my mother fussing over whether I was eating enough. My brother cracked one of his usual lazy jokes about me, always working too much, while his wife asked if I could help them just a little with some bills that had piled up. And I smiled. I nodded. I even laughed at the right moments. If they noticed anything different, they didn't show it. Inside, though, I was boiling. Every word they spoke sounded hollow, every gesture rehearsed. All I could hear beneath their voices was the memory of their laughter at my expense. As dinner went on, I studied them carefully. My brother was smug, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place, knowing full well he was living a life propped up by me. His wife was already hinting at things they wanted. Oh, we'd love to redecorate the living room, but it's just not in the budget right now. My parents nodded approvingly, as if it was my unspoken duty to make those things happen. And I played along, not because I wanted to, not because I still believed their lies, but because I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them convinced that nothing had changed, because people let their guard down when they think they've won, and I needed them defenseless. That night, as I drove home, a strange calmness settled over me. The sadness I had felt was fading, and the anger was sharpening into something colder, clearer, resolve. If they wanted me to be their fool, I'd give them a show. But when the curtain dropped, they'd regret ever underestimating me. After that dinner, something inside me clicked. I wasn't just going to cut them off. No, that would have been too easy for them. If I simply walked away, they'd spin it into some story about how I'd abandoned my family after all they'd done for me. They'd find a way to paint me as the villain. So instead, I decided to play their game. Quietly, patiently. The first step was simple. I kept helping, but on my terms. If my brother asked for rent money, I'd give him part of it, just enough to keep him thinking I was still dependable, but not enough to fix his problems entirely. If my parents hinted at house repairs, I'd offer to look into it and then drag my feet. I let them believe I was still the same reliable fool, but I was slowly tightening the faucet they'd been drinking from for years. At the same time, I started paying closer attention to their patterns. What they spent money on, who they owed, what promises they made that they couldn't keep. My brother especially had a bad habit of talking big. He'd borrow money not just from me, but from friends, coworkers, even distant relatives. He lived on a pile of shaky IOUs, and I realized just how fragile his comfortable life really was. And his wife? She was even worse. She bragged to my parents about how they were smarter than me because they got everything they wanted without lifting a finger, and she couldn't resist dropping hints about their spending habits. Expensive clothes, fancy restaurants, even a secret vacation fund. They weren't struggling. They were thriving on my back. I didn't say a word. I just listened. I smiled. I nodded. And every piece of information I gathered, I stored away like ammunition. Because if they thought I was naive before, they were about to learn what calculated really looked like. The opportunity came quicker than I expected. My brother showed up at my place one evening, looking panicked. He claimed he was in a bind because his landlord was threatening eviction if he didn't catch up on rent. He spun it like it was a matter of survival. If I didn't step in, his wife, and their kids, they didn't even have kids, by the way, but he liked to exaggerate when he needed sympathy, would be out on the street. The old me would have reached for my checkbook without thinking. But the new me? I leaned back, pretended to think hard, and said, I've been really stretched lately, but maybe I can help if you give me all the details. Who's your landlord? How far behind are you? His face tightened for a split second before he smoothed it over. He wasn't used to me asking questions. He gave me some vague numbers and a name, but something felt off. So, later that night, I did a little digging. Turns out, he wasn't behind on rent at all. In fact, his landlord had already received payment weeks ago. My brother just wanted extra cash for himself. That's when I decided it was time to start playing dirty. The next day, I called my brother and told him I had a solution. I said I'd go straight to his landlord and pay him directly so he wouldn't have to stress about late fees. The silence on the other end of the line was priceless. He tried backpedaling, saying it wasn't necessary, that he could work something out himself, but I pressed harder, insisting it was the least I could do for family. He had no choice but to agree, and when I showed up to the landlord's office, the truth spilled out instantly. The landlord looked at me like I was crazy when I asked about overdue rent. He's paid up. Early, actually, the landlord said. I smiled, thanked him, and walked away with all the confirmation I needed. When my brother later called to thank me and claim things had magically worked out, I just played dumb and said I was glad he got it sorted. But inside, I was already savoring the cracks forming in his carefully built lies. It was just the beginning. After catching my brother in his rent scam, I realized something important. He wasn't the only problem. Sure, he was manipulative and greedy, but he wouldn't have gotten away with half of it if my parents hadn't enabled him, and in many ways, encouraged it. It stung to admit, but my parents had played a big role in molding me into the family provider. Every time they praised me, it was never for my achievements, my career, or the dreams I had. It was always about how helpful I was, how lucky the family was to have me. Looking back, I could see the pattern clear as day. They didn't see me as their son so much as their insurance policy. So, I decided it was time to test them too. The next time I visited, my mother mentioned, as casually as she could, that the house needed some repairs. The roof, the plumbing, the usual urgent things that always seem to pop up when I walk through the door. Normally, I would have sighed, written a check, and told myself it was the right thing to do. But not this time. Instead, I said, I've been thinking it's probably best if we get multiple quotes before I put any money in. I'll call around and see what contractors say. Don't worry, I'll handle it. Her smile faltered. My dad shifted in his chair. They weren't expecting resistance, not even in the form of help. They expected instant obedience. Over the next week, I made a few calls, just enough to prove I wasn't bluffing. And when I reported back, I told them something interesting. The repairs weren't nearly as expensive as they had claimed. In fact, some of them weren't even necessary yet. My parents' reaction was telling. Instead of relief, I saw annoyance flicker across their faces. My mother even muttered, "Well, your brother thought it was serious," as if dragging him into it would guilt me into action. I smiled politely, kept my tone light, and said, "Good thing we checked then. No sense in wasting money on something that isn't urgent." For the first time, I saw them look at me not with gratitude, but with suspicion. They sensed I was slipping out of their grip. And that's exactly what I wanted. By now, I had learned something crucial. Revenge wasn't about anger in the moment. It was about strategy, patience, and timing. If I wanted my family to truly understand what they had done to me, it had to be loud, public, and undeniable. My first target was my brother, the easiest to trap. I knew he had been living beyond his means for years, pretending to be more successful than he actually was. I also knew he was arrogant enough to brag about it to anyone who would listen, including friends, co-workers, and distant relatives who had once considered him trustworthy. So I started planting subtle seeds. I borrowed a story he had been spreading about some big investment he'd made that was supposedly guaranteed to pay off. I hinted casually to a few of his contacts that there were complications, making sure it sounded accidental, like I'd overheard it. I also began quietly documenting every request he made of me, every favor, every dollar I'd handed over that he never paid back. Then I created a small, controlled situation that forced him to expose himself. I offered him a deal that seemed to require his cooperation, but was actually a setup. The kind of deal only someone cocky and used to taking advantage of me would agree to. True to form, he took the bait, confident I would simply fund his whims without question. The payoff came quickly. Within a few days, his lies, exaggerations, and manipulations were laid bare to the people who mattered, people whose opinions he cared about most. And when he realized what had happened, the panic in his voice was priceless. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances at home. I smiled, laughed, helped, and nodded as if nothing had changed. Inside, I was orchestrating every move like a conductor, leading a symphony of consequences. By the end of that week, my brother had finally learned a lesson he'd been too blind to understand before. Not everything that looks like loyalty or generosity is infinite. Some people notice, and they remember. And this was only the beginning. After my brother's little fiasco, I knew it was time to turn my attention to my parents. They weren't cruel in the same way my brother was. They weren't actively malicious, but they had spent decades enabling him and keeping me on a leash, praising my sacrifices while taking them for granted. The first sign that they were catching on came during a Sunday visit. My father mentioned a minor repair at the house and casually assumed I'd cover it immediately. I smiled, nodded, and said, "I can help, but let's review the options first. I don't want to rush into anything unnecessary." My mother's eyes flickered, a subtle mix of confusion and irritation. She tried to mask it with a tight smile, but I could see it. The way she shifted in her seat, the way she avoided looking directly at me. It was almost comical. Over the next few weeks, I maintained this pattern. I helped when it was convenient for me, yes, but always on my terms. Every time they tried to push me further, I gently resisted, documented what they said, and made sure I had everything recorded in a way that couldn't be denied. The tension grew slowly, like the tightening of a spring. My parents began to question themselves. Is he really upset? Is he holding something back? I didn't give them any clear answers. I just smiled, agreed with their suggestions, and kept my schedule flexible. But every action, every word, was calculated to remind them, subtly, that I was no longer theirs to control. By the time my brother had recovered from his embarrassment, my parents were already second-guessing every request. They were realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the son they had always assumed would bend and give endlessly was now a force they couldn't manipulate. And I liked watching the realization dawn in their eyes. Slowly, quietly, the balance of power was shifting. Once my brother had been humbled, it was time to deal with his wife. She had always been the mastermind behind some of the more audacious schemes. The small business that went nowhere, the extravagant shopping trips, the constant pressure to make my life easier while she indulged herself. She thrived on my brother's arrogance and my family's compliance, and I wasn't about to let her slide. I started by attending a social gathering she was hosting, where she was bragging to her friends about how her husband and I handled everything for the family. I kept quiet, smiled, and even complimented her efforts, letting her believe she was in control. But behind the scenes, I quietly recorded parts of the conversation, noting every lie, exaggeration, and self-congratulatory remark. A few days later, I orchestrated a chance encounter with a mutual friend who had previously loaned her money and never been repaid. Casually, I mentioned the investment she had bragged about at the gathering. Her face paled instantly. The friend looked surprised, then confused, and the exchange was enough to let her social circle see the truth. She had been living a life built on deception and manipulation. I didn't confront her directly. I didn't need to. The humiliation was perfect because it was public, undeniable, and completely her own doing. She realized the hard way that people noticed the cracks in the perfect image she had painted. Meanwhile, I kept my relationship with her polite but distant. I helped when I wanted, ignored when I didn't, and let her uncertainty simmer. By the time the weekend ended, the air around her had changed. She wasn't confident, she wasn't smug, and she wasn't untouchable anymore. The lesson was clear. Manipulation has a price, and I was finally in a position to make everyone who had treated me as a fool understand it. By now, the web I had been weaving for months was ready. My brother had been humbled, his wife exposed, and my parents were quietly questioning everything they had taken for granted. It was time for the full reveal, a moment that would leave no room for denial or excuses. I invited the entire family to a celebration dinner, framing it as a casual gathering to show my appreciation for them. They all came, unsuspecting, smiles in place, confident that I was still the generous, compliant son who would fund their whims and nod along to their complaints. Once everyone was seated, I began to speak. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply presented facts, documented loans, unfulfilled promises, and examples of every lie and manipulation I had quietly recorded over the past months. I had spreadsheets, emails, and even recorded conversations ready to back up every word. My brother's smugness faltered first. He tried to laugh it off, saying it was all a misunderstanding. His wife grew pale, nervously twisting her hands. My parents sat frozen, mouths open, unable to explain away years of enabling behavior. Then I added a final twist. I revealed how I had subtly corrected some of their lies without confrontation, how I had forced them to face the truth in front of others, exposing them without needing to raise my voice. The room went silent. For the first time in my life, they were on the defensive. Their manipulation, arrogance, and entitlement had no power here. I could see the realization dawn in their eyes. This was the son they had underestimated for years, the one they had mocked behind his back. And now, they were powerless. It was intoxicating, but not in a way that felt cruel. It felt like justice, quiet but absolute. The days after the dinner were surreal. My brother avoided my calls. His wife refused to speak to me, and my parents treated me with a mix of guilt and cautious respect they had never shown before. For the first time, I could make decisions without worrying about their immediate approval or their demands. It wasn't easy. Part of me felt a pang of sadness as I realized how much my family had relied on me and how long I had let myself be used. But that sadness was quickly replaced by clarity. I had given them the chance to respect me voluntarily, and they had chosen manipulation instead. With that clarity came freedom. I started reclaiming my life piece by piece. I resumed planning my long-delayed travels, booking trips I had dreamed of for years. I invested in experiences rather than endlessly bailing out others. And most importantly, I set clear boundaries. My help was no longer automatic or unconditional. If they wanted support, they had to earn it or face the consequences of their past behavior. Interestingly, some of the relationships began to shift. My parents, humbled and confronted with the truth, started showing genuine respect. My brother and his wife, still smarting from exposure, became cautious, almost deferential. The balance had changed, and I finally felt in control of my own life. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving for others. I was living for myself. Looking back, I realized this experience taught me more about life and myself than any book, job, or lecture ever could. I learned that kindness without boundaries can be weaponized, that generosity can be mistaken for weakness, and that people will take what they can if you let them. But I also learned the power of patience and strategy. I didn't lash out in anger. I didn't burn bridges recklessly. I observed, documented, and waited for the right moment to act. The satisfaction wasn't in hurting anyone. It was in reclaiming my life, showing that manipulation and entitlement have consequences, and setting clear limits on how I allow others to treat me. Today, I travel the world, pursue my dreams, and help others, but on my own terms. I've built boundaries that no one can cross without my consent. And every time I think about the family who once saw me as a naive fool, I feel a quiet satisfaction knowing they finally understand what it means to be underestimated. If there's one piece of advice I could offer anyone in a similar situation, it's this: generosity is a strength, but it must be balanced with discernment. Protect your dreams. Protect your time. Protect yourself, because no one else will do it for you. And sometimes the loudest lessons are the ones people learn the hard way.